Today, I want to talk about the first Roman emperor, Augustus Caesar, and I want to talk about how he failed to reform the Roman culture. If you look at how to reform a culture, you want to look at 5 different methods. And so the first of these is to reform your rituals. By ritual, I don't mean a religious ritual. I mean something that you do um, as a ceremony, as a piece of etiquette. So let me give you a few examples. A wedding is a ritual. And when you meet somebody for the first time, say in a business setting or an interview, you shake their hand. That's also a ritual. These do not have to do with worshiping gods or spirits, but they are rituals nonetheless. And the term for that in Confucianism is li, right? So that's the first method. The second method is to reform specifically music. And music has a number of components. One, of course, is the lyrics. Second is the melody. Third is the rhythm or the beat. And each of these has actually a moral component to it, as well as an emotional component. Okay. Number 3, your third method is to use virtue as a way to lead people through example. And so a subset of that is to use rank. So if you, as a person of great power or high status, behave well, conduct yourself well, that inspires people naturally. All right. Number 4 is that you produce literature or narrative of a morally instructive kind. So your stories should have an exploration of moral virtue. And of course, the 5th one is that you have laws to punish wickedness and even to reward goodness. All right. So in all of these 5 ways, Augustus only really comes close to succeeding in the 5th, the fixing of the laws or the reforming of the laws, right? So let's go through some history here and talk about how he fails with each of these. All right. During Augustus's reign of power, he does do a kind of reformation of ritual. However, the reformation of ritual that he does is religious, right? So he basically revives some rituals. He also consolidates worship of the gods. And he has something that is later called, or that is called the worship of the Augustus genius, okay, which is really a word for the guiding spirit, kind of like the word zeitgeist, all right? So really what this becomes known as later is the imperial cult, where you are supposed to basically indirectly worship the emperor as a god, right? So this is more of a power grab. Now, if you look at what Confucians do, what they reform are rituals like weddings or funerals or coming of age rituals, all right? In China is called capping, or other family rituals, okay? You also, we talked about Li as also relating to etiquette and daily behaviors that are not of a formal kind, all right? So one of the Confucian ways of reforming Li is to segregate male and female, such that you are not just casually interacting with each other. For example, you do not touch a woman who is not your wife, all right? So they're pretty clear about these things, and this all has to do with creating boundaries, creating a bubble of personal space so that you do not accidentally or you're not tempted to transgress into more serious transgressions, right? So Augustus doesn't really do these things. We have during this time some degree of reformation. So at some point in Roman history, early Roman history, there are public baths. Now, back then, you don't even have something like spandex, which already is not really covering up enough. But back then, right, they didn't have specialized fabric, so they didn't wear anything while they bathed. And these baths in the Roman times were public, and they did not separate the male and the female. All right, and so that ends up at some point needing to be reformed. All right, so there's some great degree of degeneracy, and there is some reformations, but it doesn't really go as far as it needs to. All right. Okay, let's talk about number two, music. There is some reformation here again regarding lyrics, but the thing about the lyrics is that, and we'll talk about this later, the lyrics themselves are not really instructive about personal morality, about morality that does not involve what they might have called back then public morality, meaning the duties you owe to the state. Okay, but there is some degree of reformation here, right? However, the other two elements besides the lyrics, the melody and the rhythm, it remained as it did before. And if you listen to some of this and a lot of this, it actually sounds a lot like sensual jazz, right? It's licentious, right? It's promoting of licentiousness, of lewdness. And it's something that you could see a rapper today sample, honestly, into his own kind of music. All right. So music, again, is not morally neutral. All right. It is actually, because it bypasses the conscious mind, very impactful in changing one's soul. So you need to not only reform the lyrics, you need to reform the melody and the rhythm. All right, let's go on to number three, personal example and rank. So Confucius tells us it's better to lead with Li. We talked about that. That was number one. And the virtue, duh. So that's what we're addressing here. Okay. So what you need for a properly functioning society is that those who have high status, high ranking, and those who have power, they need to have and model great virtue. All right. So this is the biggest failing, honestly, of Augustus. Okay. So in his personal life, he's known for, I think he has a daughter, and, she commits adultery, so he expels her, he exiles her. But he himself, according to historians, Roman historians, commits adultery, right? So he has these other politicians, right, who nominally, and this is another weakness of his, he doesn't call himself emperor, even though he's exercising great power. He calls himself princeps, meaning first citizen, first among citizens, right? So he's pretending to be equal, right? And that fiction of equality is maintained. You can't have this fiction of equality and be able to lead by example because you lose the ability to rank, right? Ranking people is diametrically opposed to pretending everybody is equal. All right. So you can't rank persons by virtue, which is what you need to do in order to properly lead a society. Okay. So that's one problem, but he himself committed adultery, right? He slept with the wives of a lot of these other politicians, these senators, these patricians, and so forth. All right. So adultery is a crime that is of the highest nature. Adulterers, historically, particularly Confucian societies, would be put to death. It's in the Bible that if a man commits adultery with another man's wife knowingly, he is put to death. Okay, so these are very serious crimes, and historically their punishment has been capital. And you have Augustus, the so-called first citizen, who's really the emperor, the very first emperor, and he is sleeping around with other men's wives. Okay, but still, even here, um, when we think about this world of rank and personal example, we also need to be careful about language. All right, so we need to make sure, as Confucius says, that names and reality have a one-to-one correlation, that they correspond with each other. So if you are a father, your actions and your feelings are that of a father. If you are a lord, your actions and your feelings are that of a lord. Okay? So um, this gets us to this issue of chastity, right? Now, the Latin word for chastity, from my research, and this might be incorrect, is univira. Okay? Simply sexual restraint is that you're a woman and you are married, you have only one man for your entire life. So that is the ideal standard. Okay. And we'll talk a little bit about what Augustus does later on regarding this. And it's not in the right direction. Okay. But the problem is here. In a Confucian society, what you do is you honor chaste women. Okay. That is a name for a woman who is completely faithful to only one man her entire life, before, during, and after marriage. She does not get remarried. And that is something that is named and honored. And that's not what Augustus does. In fact, he does the opposite. Right? We'll get to that in number 5. All right, number 4, instructive literature. What do the Confucians do? All right, there's instructive literature. Now you could talk about works of philosophy, but it's philosophy. The common people don't really read philosophy, right? So let's look at one example. Let's look at the Joseon dynasty. The Joseon dynasty under King Sejong, they published the 3 fundamental bonds, right? This is a book about these exemplary persons who are exemplary sons or exemplary wives, exemplary ministers or subjects, okay? People who are really going above and beyond the standard of duty, of moral duty that they have or they owe. All right, so these are women who would rather die than get remarried, or face poverty rather than get married. You know, so it's honored, right? You have this narrative, these stories, these true stories of exemplary persons. Okay, the closest Augustus gets to this is the Aeneid, and I'm sorry, but I might not be pronouncing that correctly. Aeneid, Aeneid. But look, English is not really a perfectly phonetic language. If you, speaking of Korea, right? If you were to look at Korean spelling, Hangul, you would actually know exactly, just based off of what it looks like on the piece of paper that you're looking at or on the screen, you would know exactly how to pronounce it. Okay, that's not something that happens with English. All right, I don't know if this is supposed to be Aeneid. I don't know if this is Aeneid. I don't really know. Okay, but anyways, you have these commissioned works, but they don't really do the same thing where you're emphasizing the fundamental bonds, right, between parent and child, between subject and lord, between husband and wife, right? It was really there to glorify the state and encourage this kind of Roman understanding of manifest destiny. All right. Okay, number 5, the laws, right? So Augustus basically gives incentives for people to have children because the Roman population is declining. Now, this isn't really going to work too well, but how does he give incentives? He basically punishes people if they don't have children, right? So the state is going to take their inheritance. And then they also, this is where, this gets back to the destruction of chastity. He actually forces women by threat of punishment to get remarried. All right. So if you're a woman and you don't have at least 3 children, then you need to get remarried. Right. So that is actually the opposite of what you're supposed to do. Why does he want the population to rebound? Well, he wants the economy and the military to be stronger. All right. Okay. So this doesn't really work either because, as Confucius points out in Analects 2.3, if you use law, stuff like administrative injunctions and penal law, then the people will not have a sense of conscience or shame, and they will only try to avoid punishment. Augustus is going the wrong direction. Really, what he wants is more of a bigger population so that Rome is stronger economically and militarily. And so he's going to do some things to essentially destroy the family in order to have more of a population. So you see the kind of mentality that he has. Augustus, in Confucian terms, is not a true king. He's not a true leader. He is a hegemon. He's a man who wants to expand his power. And a hegemon works by being very clear about what he wants and being predictably enforcing what he wants. Okay, so if he says, I will have this law, and if you break the law, I will give this punishment, that's something you can rely on. He doesn't try to trick you or deceive you into doing what he wants. He's just very clear about it, and he enforces that. Okay, so Augustus is most closely to a hegemon than anything else, if you look at him overall. Doesn't mean he never used deception or anything, but overall, that is his, the way that he operates, okay? His modus operandi, if you want to use that term. Now, this is interesting because the Roman Empire never really changes from that, okay? And in fact, it actually gets worse. They go through this bread and circuses building phase where they build the Colosseum and, not just for Rome, but, you have these amphitheaters, other places of performance and spectacle throughout the Roman territories, okay? Throughout the Roman Empire, okay? Not only in their original city-state of Rome, okay? So this is known as bread and circuses today, okay? And so what you're doing is you're not morally and spiritually uplifting the people, okay? By spiritual, I mean more like psychological. I don't mean something like, something religious, right? But basically, you are uplifting their spirits, right? Instead of demoralizing them, right? You're doing the opposite of that. That's what I mean. And so Rome is never able to really do that. So it is overall a failure in government throughout its whole existence, even though it controls lots of territory, even though materialistically it can enrich the wealthy. Overall, it's a moral failure. It is not a place of justice. By the time the Romans send an envoy throughout Eurasia, they eventually reach China during, I believe, either the late Han Dynasty or the early Tang Dynasty. But what's interesting here is that what they call what the Chinese call the Roman Empire, they call it Da Qin, meaning Great Qin. What is Qin? Qin is approximately 15-year-old dynasty that overthrew the Zhou dynasty, and it was extremely legalistic, right? So everything operated in laws. It was essentially oppressive and tyrannical, and it was more or less in opposition or simply anti-Confucian. So this is not praise for the Romans. When this envoy reaches China, by that point they are Confucian. They've been back to Confucian for a while. The Qin dynasty is in the past. And they're looking at the Romans and they're looking at how they operate and how they see the world. And they're like, wow, these guys are like the Qin. This is really important to understand today. Okay, and this is probably another thing to talk about. So here I'm going to talk about lessons for us today, right? So if you're living in America or in any kind of modern state, you have basically the same problems. You don't want to repeat Augustus's failures. You don't want to repeat Rome. You don't want to ever look up to Rome in general. But you don't want to repeat what Rome did. So when you're trying to understand, okay, my demographics are declining, people are not having children, don't follow the steps of Augustus. Instead, what you should do is you follow the steps of the Rue, the Confucian, right? So you need to rectify Li. You need to reform things like weddings and funerals, institute coming of age ceremonies, all right, so that you can restore harmony to the family on a day-to-day basis, so that young men and young women can take their responsibilities seriously as their biology changes right after they go through puberty or as they start puberty, so that you don't have these, I don't know, 6 years or so where they have these urges, and you know obviously what I'm referring to, but there's no constructive way to go about it. Okay, it that would destroy the family. So you need order within the family, and that starts with Li, ritual propriety. Okay, you want to reform the music. You cannot let this garbage, whether it's pop music, whether it's rap, whether it's hip hop, whatever it is, you cannot let that be the dominant kind of music. In fact, you might even have to censor much of this music based off of lyrics, but even melody and rhythm. At the very least, your state needs to fund good music. All right. You need to rank people. You cannot continue this mythology, this fiction of everybody's equal. People are not equal. People are not equal in terms of their virtue, in terms of their wisdom. They're not morally equal. And we need to recognize that, and we need to be able to establish very clear bright lines, right? A woman who is completely faithful to one man her whole life deserves to be honored. All right. We need to restore names. Currently, people think the word chastity means sexual restraint. That's not really what it means. It means something greater than that, more noble than that. Okay. Our leaders need to be first and foremost moral people. It should still be a scandal and a shame that somebody ends up with a divorce. All right. And in the cases that we want to make an exception, we need to make sure that this person's divorce is not really his fault, right? That that the other woman violated their bond, right? Maybe through adultery or something, right? In fact, it's basically, I'm saying if a man gets divorced, he is already inherently suspect. So, or we should have an innate suspect of such a situation, right? So we need to pay attention to right? One's own virtue, the virtue of our leaders, and we need to rank people according to virtue. 4, we need instructive literature. Okay, right now Hollywood does stuff like they basically minimize the problem of promiscuity, of they basically indirectly encourage cheating. They do these things because it's more dramatic or whatever, but it's wrong. It's simply wrong. And we need to have better stories out there that show noble people doing the right thing. Okay. Some time ago, I complained about Spider-Man because this is like a petty man's morality, right? Spider-Man, I'm talking about, the Hollywood version of Spider-Man, right? It's always, okay, do I save people's lives? That's a very petty level. Okay, what do I mean by petty? Petty means it is base, right? It is not high level. It is not grand. It is not lofty, right? So when a person simply exists, that's important, right? That's important. But that's not the most important thing, right? The most important thing is being righteous, is being moral, is being virtuous. It's worth dying in order to preserve that. Okay. In fact, it's even worth dying in order to preserve one's moral dignity, but certainly righteousness. Okay. So we need better stories out there. We need better instructive literature. Okay. Our academics, right, people who actually teach for a living should teach morality and should teach correct morality. All right. And lastly, our laws should do things like punish adultery very severely. All right. We shouldn't um, really shouldn't enable people to live together as functionally a married couple and yet tell themselves they're not actually married. All of that is wrong. And the laws should be reformed to actually abide, reflect, and align with actual real morality. So those are all things that a modern state needs to do, whether you're America, whether you are an East Asian nation, whether you're a European nation, throughout the world, it doesn't matter. As long as there are human beings and there's a human society, it needs to be governed this way.